He made an historic flight back to his family's home country. Today on Central Florida Spotlight, Channel 9's Jorge Estevez takes us inside Cuba, the island nation cut off from most Americans for decades. Hi, folks, and welcome to this very special edition of Central Florida Spotlight. Today, we take you to Cuba with the man who spent several days there on the first tourism trip to the communist country out of Orlando in some 30 years. Welcome to Spotlight, Jorge Estevez. That was an amazing trip to watch, and I imagine to live it was even better.
It was insane to be able to go there and see everything firsthand. I've been hearing these stories for decades. I'm 40 now, so I've been hearing them for about 4 decades. And I went once when I was 4, so 36 later to be able to go back and experience the island. Yes, it's got a lot of issues, a lot of political issues and problems, but to just see the buildings and see the people and meet my family was incredible.
That is fantastic. We'll look more into that and what it was like to see them for really the first time in decades. But for you, when you left Orlando and landed, you were anticipating it would be difficult, but it wasn't once you got there.
No, it wasn't. You take the plane like any other plane. You board, you're with other people. Our charter flight wasn't that full. It was a charter. That's the only reason they could go right now. Commercial's still a challenge. A charter flight from Orlando, when you get to the airport, you see the people outside. It's a regular building. You have the landing, you know, like in 1960 when they would wheel the stairs to the airplane. You go down, you go through security. You pick up your checked bags, you go through customs, and you walk out the gate, just like anywhere else. No military people, no police with guns drawn. It was just like any other airport in the Caribbean. And you see family members there hugging, embracing, just like you would at any other airport. So initially, it seemed pretty normal at first. Again, this is just on the surface. We're not talking about all the issues behind and all the layers and the decades that are behind everyone's eyeballs and in their brains. We're talking about initially what it looked like. And then you go into the actual city of Havana.
Okay, before we go to the actual city of Havana, let's take a look at your first story. You put this story together after first touching down in Cuba.
A family reunion 400 miles from Orlando. Family members here in Cuba haven't seen their relatives in years, waiting outside in 95-degree weather.
I'm so happy to see them.
Travel restrictions still in place keep Lisette's 80-year-old grandmother from easily visiting Central Florida.
How difficult to be so far.
She told me she wishes they could be together. This trip began at OIA Wednesday with the first direct flight. Families took extra luggage, paying hundreds in extra fees just to bring essentials to their family members. Then, on board the flight, jubilation. These people are doing something that until now has been very restricted. And 1 hour later, we landed. They took the final steps before making it onto Cuban soil to meet their families, like this Cuban woman seeing her 6-month-old grandson for the first time. Emotions hard for anyone to understand unless you know what it's like to have your family just an hour away and yet feel worlds apart.
But you know, once you see them, like the tears come to you, and it's an emotion you can't explain.
Wow, that's the word here. Incredibly emotional family reunions. You were able to capture that following that historic first flight, but you ended up doing another piece on how tourism and the industry in Cuba will be affected by the loosening of these travel restrictions, George, in the U.S. and Cuba. What did you find as it relates to tourism?
As it relates to tourism, I found out and I learned that actually people who want to visit Cuba for the culture, actually, the architecture, the history, it's frozen in time. Obviously, capitalism is not something that happens in Cuba. Everything is state-run. There are some independent businesses, but typically the government runs the show. So it's pretty fascinating to see a country standing still.
Tourists are no longer just capturing the images of a frozen-in-time Cuba, but also of one undergoing a very deliberate change. Yes, relics roam the streets, which, by the way, back home would cost a fortune. They share the road with reminders, though, of a more modern time. Tourists want to see this before the U.S. possibly breaks through.
Because then it's changing, and you will never see it again like it is now.
And you probably won't. We did see tour buses, though, as we might see back home on iDrive, but here they ride alongside casual carriages and cocoa taxis because they look like, well, coconuts on wheels.
I think it's a bit to go back in time.
But the tourist that comes to admire the Spanish architecture, the open-air plazas, and the quaint eateries is not a threat to the Central Florida economy.
But clearly our brand is very different from what you would expect from an exotic Caribbean destination.
That is very clear.
In Disney World, it's all brand new. It's built up, so it's a copy of the interesting things in the world. So, and we like to see the original, so that's why.
And she's right. You can't find this anywhere else. You see people struggling to make it. You know that's the case. And they're surrounded by the grandeur of a time so in the distance, for them looking back would be pointless.
Again, so your impression there of the country was very vivid in that story. George, did you get the sense from the people that were there that they were glad to see you?
I got to tell you, there is some level of hope. When I say hope, I mean hope within the people that are dealing in the tourist industry, that most tourists that are there right now are European. They're hopeful that perhaps people who will come now from the United States will spend some of their money. You get a sense of people have some sense of, well, maybe this will work.
Very interesting. All right. Just incredible observations and reporting from George from a country that is so close, but still so far away in many ways. When we come back after the break, we'll take a look at the 12 ways U.S. citizens are able to get on a flight to Cuba. We'll have that and much more on this special edition, taking you to Cuba on Central Florida Spotlights. Welcome back to Central Florida Spotlight, joined again by Channel 9 anchor and reporter Jorge, who returned last week from really a life-changing trip. Spent 4 days in Cuba, traveling there on an historic flight out of Orlando. It's the first one that went to the communist country in some 30 years. So, George, what are the reasons U.S. citizens can use travel to Cuba now that certain travel restrictions have been lifted?
Yes, they have been lifted. For example, you can go there. There's 12 reasons you can go there. Family visits, which is how I went the first time back in 1979. Official business, other reasons, journalistic activity. Also professional research, educational activities, religious activities, which is something that Cuba, when you think religion, you don't think Cuba, because at one point religion was barred from the island. Public performances, for example, clinic workshops, athletic and other competitions, support for the Cuban people, humanitarian projects. Obviously, that is something that Cuba can really benefit from, whether it's church groups here or any other kind of humanitarian groups going over there. Exportation, importation, and a certain export transaction. So a lot of technical terms, but typically culture, education, family visits. Those are the main reasons how people can get in to the island.
You talked about that charter company. Are we close to having commercial flights taking us there?
JetBlue is already boasting commercial flights coming out of New York, and the charter's the way to go for right now because it's easier. The island travel and tour company sponsored the plane. It was actually half full.
Very interesting. So the question that you've almost answered already, is that country ready for an influx, whether it's JetBlue or other airlines?
I did some number crunching, talked to some people, and found out that, yes, they're excited about tourism and there is hope, but the reality is the country not really ready.
The music is here, so is the mystique and the marvels wherever you look. But if more people like these start needing more of these and places to stay like this, then Havana needs to sign up for Tourism 101.
There's been as many highs as lows. It's a challenging place to travel.
The Singletons have experienced Cuba on their honeymoon and feel they should have been able to accomplish twice as much.
But every time that you're asking for advice or a simple thing like you want a map or you need to know where you want to go, nobody can tell you anything.
Havana has 67 hotels with more than 25,000 rooms. Sounds large, but it's not. And the infrastructure, like the buildings, are in disrepair. Cruising into Cuba would be the only way at first, but right now the port can only accept 2 smaller ships at one time. Larger cruise ships would have to tender. The restaurants have plenty of room, but supplies can run low. Power is sometimes sporadic, and the heat, well, forget central AC. You may have to be your own biggest fan here.
I would advise people to come and see it, but you'd just be prepared.
It's really neat, all the sights and sounds that you guys were able to capture in Cuba. Eventually, will they be prepared, in your opinion, for a larger tourism market?
Well, here's the thing. As we said in that piece, hotels are being built. They're being renovated. But the problem is, without a lot of supplies, without a lot of manpower, it's just going to take that much longer. So the cruising industry is really the safest bet right now for people who want to go and travel when that opens up, which we know it's opening up come next spring with Carnival. So that's going to be a safe bet for tourists because it's a ready-made hotel on the water.
You did go to one place that seems the most ready.
Yes, it's a famous beach. It's on the outskirts, 2.5 miles on a highway from Havana. It's called Varadero. And Varadero Beach was famous in the 20s, 30s, 40s. It's where Hollywood went. It's resorts. They have about 10,000 rooms. And let me tell you, it was quite the experience. It almost looks like something you would see here in Central Florida on our East Coast.
A familiar sound, but somehow this seems a bit more unique. Most Americans haven't seen this in more than 50 years.
It's an interesting culture, and it's been removed from a lot of other cultures.
Varadero is prepared for an influx. They have 70 hotels, 10,000 rooms, and even an 18-hole golf course, plenty of cafes, and typical Caribbean markets. Gladly willing to help you remember your trip. This hotel employee said Americans would love it here on the outskirts. Mark and Debbie from Canada do. They've returned 3 times.
Most tourist traps, it's all about the money. So people are very relaxed in Cuba.
This town even has its own version of a traditional year-round fair. But tourists have a joke for potential American business interests who make their way in.
I just do not want to see a McDonald's in Cuba or a Starbucks.
So, Varadero?
Very good.
There you go.
Nice.
It's the closest thing to what we would recognize as a tourist-type resort. But what about Cuban citizens? Are they able to go there and enjoy the place?
You know, obviously I have family there, and that's the reality. The sad reality is that, you know, they make 10, 20, 30 US dollars a month. They can't afford to go to those places. They can't afford a $10 meal because that's that's all their salary for the month. And you have to find food for your family. You have to clothe your family. You have to figure out a way. People there only can make it with family back here. You do what you can. Without help from family members on this side, they can't make it, let alone go on vacation.
So interesting. Good perspective there as well. Next, we're going to learn a little bit more about George's ties to Cuba and the family members that you heard him talk about being reunited with after decades and decades of not seeing them. We'll have that and much more when we come back. Welcome back to Central Florida Spotlight. It's an interesting show today, joined again by Channel 9 anchor and reporter George Estevez. George, thanks for spending all of this time with us today, and it really feels like a postcard that you've taken us and given us kind of the family movies of a fantastic and historic trip to Cuba.
That's what my photojournalist Octavio Torres and I felt like we were doing. We were documenting something, and there was so much interest from back here. Everyone who tweeted, who followed me on Facebook, and who saw the pictures and commented, some in favor of easing the restrictions in Cuba and some not in favor. So there's a lot of opinions, but what you can't lose sight of is all the images, everything that people see that they're interested in because it's a secret. A bartender at a hotel told me people come here for 3 things. They come here for the good people, because Cuban people are known to be good people. They come here because of the curiosity of the island, and they come here because of the history of the island.
And for you, there was a 4th reason.
Yeah, there sure was. My family, geez, I hadn't seen, I went when I was 4. There's some pictures of me and you know, and funny 70s clothing, but I was able to go there and spend time with my cousins, and it was something that you don't really realize that is missing until you go there and reunite with them. They got together, and it was something.
First, my cousin met me at my hotel. I met his wife. Then it was off to his house for the big reunion.
Esa sonrisa sí. ¿Tu mamá?
There, I met my extended family on my mom's side.
Hello!
And more waited upstairs. And with each embrace, the hugs, you guys, just got tighter and tighter.
You know, with each hug, I was like, I don't know how much more of this I can take as far as like overflowing with emotion.
As if to make up for all the times we never had the chance to embrace.
Tú tenías 4 años cuando viniste.
4 años?
4 años cuando viniste.
I was 4 the last time I saw my family in Cuba. Here's proof. The year was 1979. I remember playing in the streets with my little cousins and beating the heat in a neighborhood pool. Time with the family you end up taking for granted. But not tonight. 10 minutes into the night and they were busting my chops over how much I was already sweating. They said, "Aren't you from Florida?" 90+ degrees, but the difference, no air conditioning.
It's amazing how hot it could be in July in Cuba.
So, as we caught up, dinner was served. Our meal looked like Christmas Eve dinner. Out front, my cousin gave the toast, blessing us all, and then it was off to eat. Dinner tables don't usually look like this in Cuba. My family saved for weeks to make this meal happen. There was pork, you see rice, yuca, all kinds of sides were being served. My emotions got the best of me when it was my turn to toast. But I somehow got through it. I wanted them to know how much I appreciated this moment, their sacrifice to make it around this table, to see me, their cousin from Orlando.
I'll come back. I can't wait to come back. Maybe not with the camera or lights, but I'll come back. And I'll see this place again. And it's gonna be great.
just an incredibly emotional piece, and we, I think, got a better perspective of what it's like to be so close, but yet so far from family.
Yes, 400 miles from Central Florida, 90 miles from Key West, the famous southernmost point. We see that. But you're far because calling them is a challenge. I have to get a prepaid calling card. It's like 69 cents a minute. You know, email, yes, there's some sporadic email now entering the country. Fun fact, they have an email account now, state-sponsored, for $1.50 a year. So they have that now, but that is even sporadic. Sending a picture, it can't be too big. There's all this communication issue, and you're like, you're right there. I mean, that's 400 miles is what? If you go north, how far do you get? Do you get to Georgia?
Yeah, probably get to Atlanta.
I mean, so when you do the math, they're right there, but yet they're so far, and communicating and sending them something. You can UPS something to your sons in college. I can't UPS something to my cousin in Cuba.
So there's no FedEx that goes to the island?
No, there's no FedEx. There's your cousin's neighbor's brother that can pick you up something, but there's a limit. You can only carry 44 pounds. Anything over that, you have to pay $2 or $3 or $4. Depends on the mood of the country or the airport. It's such a challenge to permeate the island, even though it's so close.
Another challenge for you, and it's maybe not depicted right there in that piece, but just how hard emotionally it was to leave those people behind.
It was horrible. You know, saying goodbye, Saturday night, we were leaving Sunday, saying goodbye was very challenging because, you know, you're saying goodbye, you're not going to see them tomorrow. So after going upstairs to my hotel room, you just kind of lose it a little bit because you're not going to join them in the morning. He's not going to be with me as I'm taking all these amazing pictures around the island, especially my cousin, Luis. So, you know, you figure that out and you break down, and then the next day we had a driver who helped us go around the island. That's the only way. You can't drive. Don't recommend driving. No. And then you go and he goes, well, you're sad. I said, yeah, I'm sad. I'm not going to see my cousin. He goes, no, you're going to see him one more time. We're picking him up and we're taking him to the airport with you. Oh, what was that about? Right. I lost it again. So, because you don't know what's going to happen. There is so much unsurety on that side that you are afraid of what may or may not happen.
Wow. Very, very deep. Interesting. All right, when we come back, we'll get some general observations about life and conditions in Cuba. We'll also find out firsthand from George what you need to do if you want to explore Cuba. That and more in our final segment. Welcome back to Central Florida Spotlight, joined again by Channel 9's George Estevez. He's been talking about his recent trip for us to Cuba. What are your general impressions of life in Cuba, day-to-day life for people who live there?
Hard. I was able to go somewhere with my family one night and there was a comedian. It was just a random show. I don't know how often they have these at this very historic restaurant. He said, you know, the one thing we have in Cuba that you Americans don't is time. I can sell you time and still have time left over because there's not a lot of jobs. There's not a lot of things for them to do. So that's one of the biggest challenges that I found. They'd like to work more, but there is nowhere for them to work. So that the observation is that the Cuban people still have a lot to overcome and a lot that they don't have.
Is there any hope for improvement, and does this opening of travel restrictions possibly help with that?
Some people will tell you that we should stay hard on the embargo and not travel, and only for family reasons and emergency reasons. Some people will tell you it hasn't worked for 55 years, the embargo or the tightening of restrictions. Why don't we try that? There's two very passionate arguments, even in my own family. Even if people sitting at home right now may know someone who is Cuban, who went through that. Think about it. A lot of these people had uncles, had fathers who were political prisoners because they spoke out against the revolution. They spoke out against the Castro revolution, and they were put in jail. That's how the stories go, and that's how it went according to people that lived it. So you have a lot of passions, but then you have this new generation of people, and time is a great way to forget for newer generations. And they may say, what do these people have to do with what happened 50 years ago? That's just the argument. No one's taking sides here.
Let's talk about some of the things that the images that I have seen in pictures, you've now verified with video. And to me, because I'm a car buff, the old cars.
Can I just tell you, those were huge on all our social media accounts. The Chevys, one after the other. Some were beautifully kept. Oh, you could see yourself in the chrome. I looked. And some were not. And the paint job was missing and the inside was missing. Those were the taxis. Those were the ones that people used to drive around. That was the one maybe you gave to your 20-year-old to get back and forth to work. But there were some cars, wow, convertible cars, yellow cars, cars that, I mean, were red and shiny and pink and this and that. It was out of grease lightning.
What should people who are going to do this, what should they bring with them that they can bring that would really make things maybe a little bit more comfortable?
Kleenex and patience. Because, you know, when you go there, it just hits you. But, I mean, outside of preparing yourself emotionally for seeing this, you go with light clothing and you go with your camera because there's images everywhere. Obviously, I would recommend a travel agent. I would recommend a tour company. There's no other way to get there. Go with an organized group, perhaps, and then sign up for certain, excursions, if you will, because they do exist. You can go here with a group. You can go there with a group.
And there is strength in numbers, whether it's buying power or the ability to see something, or it also maybe feel safer.
And speaking of safety, look, I never felt unsafe. Even when I went to a couple of souvenir shops, I never felt like I was getting ripped off. At one point, I gave $8, it was $7. She gave me $1 back. I mean, so it's different. The people, that's the heart of the country, and that's the whole point of this.
Must you speak Spanish to go there?
Sí. I mean, you don't have to speak Spanish, but it definitely will help. The people, the tour guides, there are tour guides there, by the way, that spoke English. But, I mean, it's few and far between of the people who speak English.
Going back in time is the best way to look at it.
There's no other way. You're going back to a time, 1950s, when before the revolution, they had an open relationship with the United States. They had Coca-Cola, we had Coca-Cola. We both had Chevys at the same time. We both had freezers. We both had movies. So you're going back to that, only it's not as taken care of. It's almost like not painting your house for 50 years. What is it going to look like?
Right. Interesting. All right. Very good.
Good stuff.
All right. Enjoyed it, George. And that wraps up this edition of an incredible look at a place we've seen very little of for more than half a century, but a place intimately tied to America and especially Florida. We have to thank Channel 9 anchor Jorge for bringing us this exclusive look at Cuba, and thank you for watching. Join us again next week for another edition of Central Florida Spotlight. Until then, have a great remainder of your weekend and take care.